Dragon Ball Super. While everyone else is freaking out about this Ultra Instinct whatever, I'm over here in the Goku Black arc, all alone, watching the dub as it airs on television. I've heard it gets better, but right now, Super is legitimately the worst anime I've ever seen. The writing is often horrendously contrived. The characters have been diluted to the point of unrecognizability, and we've all seen the examples of rushed animation. That last one has sort of become a meme so popular that a lot of people who know nothing about animation seem content to pick random in-between frames and call them out for being terrible. Others who know more have found legitimate problems that were later fixed for the Blu-ray release and such. I don't know whether the version being aired on American television is the corrected version or if it's the original version, but what I do know is that a lot of the animation isn't a whole lot better. They fixed some of the more egregious stuff, but we're still left with some corner-cutting techniques and framing and direction that make DBZ look like a Disney movie in comparison. However, since I don't want to get shut down by the copyright police, I won't be showing examples of this, nor talking about it any further in this video really. No, what I want to talk about is something that I feel would be an enormous problem even if all of the animation was perfect. Something that for me strips nearly all of the finesse and character out of many of the scenes regardless of the animation, leading to a pretty ugly show even if you do ignore the other issues. My biggest problem with Super's look is the awful line art that permeates a good 85% of the scenes up to the episode I'm on now. Super almost always refuses to add any varying line weight to its line art. Super doesn't even really like to imply line weight in its line art a lot of the time. Now, for anyone who's not really an artist, you might not know what any of this means. Line art, put simply, is the outline for shapes in art. Line art isn't always used in illustration, but it's pretty ubiquitous in animation. Usually, a show that doesn't employ line art is one with a style that's unlike anything else you see on the market. Line weight, likewise, is the thickness of the lines used for said line art. Line weight can vary rather wildly between shows and even scenes depending on what's needed. Generally, Western cartoons have thicker lines these days than their anime peers, and this is despite the fact that much of the animation done for these Western shows is done in places like South Korea. Quick note, in the background are line art illustrations of my own, which should hopefully give you a good idea for what varying line weight can look like. Line weight can convey a lot about the style you want your show to have, and even help solidify the tone of a show. But the most effective way to use it in general is actually to vary line weight across a frame of animation. This does several things. It can help to stylize the art to a higher degree, giving it a more unique feel. It can convey motion and depth better in a shot. It can strengthen silhouettes with thicker outlines and allow for more internal detail with thinner lines inside of an object. Proper use of varying line weight can even imply lines that aren't there, which not only has multiple of its own benefits when used right, but can also save time per frame of animation. Heavily variable line weight is the core of many great artists' styles, including those like Tetsuya Nomura. Aside from the zippers, belts, and spikes, his work is also most commonly recognized for the thick, dark, but really dynamic line work. Attack on Titan would largely look great even if it didn't have the polished action scenes it does, largely because it utilizes varying line weight really effectively. So even static scenes of characters like this one here can look stylized and dynamic. Even shows like Danny Phantom or other Butch Hartman shows use varying line weight effectively, even if your overall perception of it is that it's just chock full of lines as wide as the Grand Canyon. Most of its individual lines are static in line weight, but different sections get different weights, making it less manufactured looking than many of the similar, but much worse looking Flash animation styled shows from that era. The thing is, Super quite often forgoes any use of dynamic line weight, which leaves shots looking lifeless and manufactured. Even really important shots and action shots can sometimes use static line weight, and it saps nearly all style from the art. Notice how in this first example with Vegeta, how the lines only vary in thickness to a very, very small degree? While it doesn't necessarily look bad because this shot is pretty squarely on model, it also just sort of looks boring. It makes the lines almost look too dark because they feel the same even in places where they're designed to imply shape rather than show shape, like the lines that denote his brow ridge and forehead shape. If we go to the second example, things only get worse. It barely looks like there's a single line here that's a different weight. Even the scratch marks denoting damage to Goku's face and body, they're far too thick, leading to them looking extremely dark and out of place. Even in this third example, which is of a highly exaggerated, comedic moment that's perfect for wild line weight, everything is static. The lines look like they were created with the generic line tool in a freshly installed vector art program. They're so lifeless. Now, it's not all bad. There are points where the line work improves, like this example of Goku here, which contrasts well with the earlier shot of Vegeta. And it seems like it also improves quite a bit during later episodes I haven't gotten to yet, as seen here. But still, I don't know why it had to be this way in the first place. Dragon Ball Z definitely had its fair share of rushed and iffy animation, as well as less than fantastic art and line work. There are definitely points where the line work looks really boring and static. It's far from perfect. Compare those earlier Super screenshots to these from Z. This first one of Gohan here definitely is the most flat, with the line weight being pretty even throughout the piece. But you can still see variances where it makes sense, like in the folds of the shirt. As a clothing crease gets less prominent, lines should generally get thinner, which is exactly what the clothing is doing in this screenshot. Moving on, we've got a shot of Android 17 and Cell. Cell may look like he's grown 3 feet wider in this specific shot, but putting that aside, look how thick some of his lines can be, especially the outline. It gives the character a tough look, which fits his insect-like exoskeletal armor. Likewise, the thinner lines on 17 make him look soft, squishy, small, and vulnerable. Next is a picture of Goku and Frieza standing back to back. If you look at the lines that make up the muscles, you'll see that they often break off for moments, before coming back in. This positions the lines almost like pencil shadows at hard creases, very strong ambient occlusion, if you will. Finally, what about this example? Let's go back to the example of Goku in Super, where he's got some wear and tear on him. Now compare it to Vegeta here. Notice how not only can they fit more detailed wear and tear on him because the lines they're using are so thin, but also how they sort of blend in because they're so light. It looks like a legitimate representation of scrapes, where Goku's damage in Super, well, it looks like someone drew on his face with a Sharpie. But one other thing to note about this Vegeta example is how many lines disconnect at points. This is one of the advantages of varying line weight that we talked about earlier, where having lines trail off or even fade in and out can do a great job of giving the impression of certain shapes or details you don't actually see. Your mind fills in the empty spaces. Super seems extremely uncomfortable with implying line weight in this way, and it almost never seems to taper lines off in a way that's satisfying either, instead often just sort of stopping lines awkwardly, with what looks like a generic auto-rounded edge on their brush. Any animators who work on shows like this can correct me if I'm wrong, but dynamic line weight doesn't even seem like an expensive effect to have. For the type of artists that are skilled enough to be part of a team working on one of the most popular anime shows in history, creating varying line weight shouldn't take any more time or effort than doing the opposite. I know when I'm making an illustration, it takes the same amount of time to create final line art with or without dynamic line weight. It's a skill you need to learn, but it's also a skill all of these professionals should have learned a long time ago. And the thing is, creating this effect digitally isn't any different than it is traditionally. It took me the same exact amount of time to make each of these examples I'm about to show you, and I'm nowhere near the skill level of the artists working on these shows. Another quick note, if the line work looks kinda shaky, it's because I don't use auto line smoothing, because my version of Photoshop doesn't allow for it. So these are completely natural lines like you would see in a manga panel, just on a much larger scale canvas, so inconsistencies are easier to spot. So firstly, here's a clearer example of what varying line weight can add to an illustration, because I've removed all of the visual clutter that may come with colors, backgrounds, etc. It's just the line art. This is an illustration of my own in the style of Akira Toriyama, presented both with pressure sensitivity on my drawing tablet set to on and off. I've said it before, but notice how flat the one with the static line weight looks in comparison to the other? If you look closely, you can also see that the dynamic line weight allowed me to add further detail in places like the knuckles. It also means I can keep certain sections from becoming darker or lighter than they should be. Looking at the tail, it still looks thick with fur on the dynamic version, but it blends into the rest of the illustration better because it's not so dark. This also cuts down on the shakiness that I was talking about earlier, by the way, leading to smoother lines. If we move on to this next close-up example of Bulma here, you can also maybe notice that there's a difference in technique afforded to the artist with dynamic line weight. Remember when I said you can really effectively use weight to imply a line and fill in blank spaces for viewers? This illustrates that very well. If we step back for a moment and look at these two examples of Bulma from Super and Z, one of her only hairstyles that's easily comparable between the two series, you'll notice how they were essentially forced to close in all of the lines on her hair, because ending those lines by themselves without tapering them off would look really messy and unfinished. Unfortunately, it looks pretty messy anyway. This look is actually remarkably similar to what you see from newer artists, who haven't yet learned that you don't need to add a new line for everything you want people to see, so they overdo it and show things instead of implying things. Likewise, these two from Z have almost no connecting lines at the bottom of the hair. It lets the color do some of the heavy lifting, and it makes her hair look like it spreads and thins as it comes down. It makes the haircut look distinctly more natural than, say, this haircut she has during the Frieza saga. This example has hard lines that stop the bangs, which gives the impression that the cut of the bangs is more precise and styled. Super looks like she has Play-Doh dreadlocks on her head, but Z looks natural, even when they're closing in the bangs in the exact same way. On top of this, because the lines in Super aren't implied and are instead drawn in full, the lines look a bit uneven and imbalanced. The more lines you draw, the more precise they need to be, or else they'll contradict what people imagine it should look like. I decided once again to make this a bit clearer by drawing Bulma myself, based on a screenshot I found. Again, I drew it twice, once where I mimicked the technique used in Z, and once where I mimicked the lines used in Super. Even without the color doing some of the work, doesn't the hair just look lighter and softer in the Z-styled example? The whole thing looks more three-dimensional and natural. This is by far my biggest problem with Super's looks, which often makes scenes that are otherwise perfectly serviceable looking feel like an amateur DeviantArt piece where someone found a base and used a mouse to put their OC over it. It looks unprofessional. Super's not the only anime with this problem, but it's frustrating because Super is such a big deal. It's arguably the biggest deal in the anime scene, since it's the follow-up to one of the most widely influential shows in the medium. It should have an enormous budget and the utmost care and time put into each episode, and yet quality-wise it looks like a no-budget direct-to-DVD flash-animated hentai at points. But what do you guys think? Do you enjoy Super? Do you prefer the line art? Even if I disagree to the point where we could never be friends, I can still respect your opinion if you disagree with me. Sound off in the comments below, and I'll see you guys next time. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you're interested in another one, here's the last one that I uploaded. You can also follow me on Twitter or subscribe by hitting the subscribe button.